The following is a talk by Dr Finn MacKay from the first evening of Leeds Love Month 2003 on the topic of attraction and dating. In the talk, they explored queer identity and dating, and their presentation was followed by one from Dr Tom O'Shea and then by a Q&A. Both are available as podcasts. Leeds Love Month was organised by the Centre for Love, Sex and Relationships at the University of Leeds, and we hope to improve relationships by studying intimacy. You can follow the Centre on social media for news of future events and publications. The talk series was generously funded by the Society for Applied Philosophy.
It's great to be here and great to see such a fantastic turnout as well to discuss these sort of things of an evening. I used to actually live in Leeds many years ago, so it's nice for me to be back as well. I got here a bit earlier and had a look around your city, which has changed so much since I was last here, and I'm sure it's changing all the time. But yeah, it's really nice to be back. So I suppose my route into this whole topic that the series is covering over this month has been from my research into my latest book on female masculinities and the gender wars. So I'm drawing from the research that I did and the data that I gathered on lesbian gender identities in particular and queer masculinities, and then femme and butch lesbian identities and relationships. And so I gathered, for this book, I gathered data obviously on that, the intersection of sexuality, sexual orientation and gender identity as well. And the sort of pressures and stereotypes that some of these terms and labels engendered for people, or that they felt they had to live up to in certain ways, and in those ways affected their presentation of sexual orientation and how they went about sort of forming relationships, I suppose. And firstly, there's lots of different definitions of all those terms that I've used, and respondents in my research used loads of their own terms as well, sometimes sort of made up their own terms or joined different ones together from ones that are out there in the world at the moment. So mock, masculine of centre, GNC, gender non-conforming, non-binary. People use lots of different terms, trans-masc, or they just, as I say, sort of made up their own terms as well. There's also no singular or agreed definitions even of terms like femme and butch when you look at lesbian gender identities and the queer scholarship that's available, and massive amounts of literature, of course, on that. But what we can glean from those classics, of course, is that butch is a term for masculinity or masculine identification in lesbian communities. The term is quite Americanized. It has quite an Americanized history, perhaps. And there's other terms being used in different communities. So black lesbian communities have used terms like stud, for example, which is similar and has similar meanings. And the anthropologist and queer scholar Esther Newton defines butch as a gender expression that combines some version of the masculinity that you saw around you as a child with same-sex desire. And butch is also an identity that has been under attack from mainstream straight society, of course, and also from some elements within feminism and within feminist theory. If you look back at, say, what was called the lesbian sex wars in Britain and America, in the sort of 80s, 90s. So these particular identities, labels, femme and butch, have been branded as aping the worst of heterosexual roles, adopting and fetishizing the worst aspects and power dynamics of those. And there are some feminist theorists, of course, that do continue to use these definitions still today, and to brand and see and label those kind of relationships as inherently sadomasochistic and as a form of violence. And when I did the research for my book, these were narratives that the respondents were familiar with, well aware of, and the pressures and stereotypes that those, narratives and negative discourse out there brought, and also brought to bear on their own identity, their own sense of desirability, sexual attractiveness, and their, views about relationships with others. And I also asked, in the research, I asked about the relationship between gender and sexuality. And psychologists that have studied lesbian communities, such as Levitt and Heistand, have reported gender identity and sexual orientation as being experienced as core identities or core parts of self. And that's also studied by queer theorists like Professor Sally Munt, Joan Nestle, of course. And the respondents to my research said the same, that they felt their gender identity was intrinsic to their sense of self. And it was experienced and it was felt as if it was innate. And so people used language like, I have always felt blah, 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 or I've always been so-and-so way. Although nearly everyone that took part in the research was very aware of the power of social construction, they were not saying that these things were biological or innate, but they were saying that they were lived or felt as if they were, or with the power as if they were. And some people said they felt that they would have had the same gender or gender identity and orientation, whatever their sexuality had actually turned out to be, or maybe in the future if it changed. So just looking at some of the quotes that I used in the book. So one respondent said, who described themselves as a butch lesbian, said, I'm not sure what came first, hatred of dresses or love for women. And another person said, I can't imagine being feminine any more than I can imagine being straight. And another genderqueer person said, it's about not identifying as feminine, something from a very young age I have tried to do, and I have identified with masculinity my whole life. It has been how I have felt deep-rooted inside. And then another non-binary genderqueer person, regardless of my sexual identity, I would always feel like this in my gender identity and expression. I would dress and express myself like this, even if I was heterosexual. And, obviously these are snippets. There was a lot more that people had to say about that. So about the pressure of the stereotypes and some of the sort of well-worn critiques that I've mentioned and assumptions, and negative assumptions about butch identities and relationships. So some people were very well aware that their identity was seen as old-fashioned in some way, or maybe backwards. And that was raised by some people. They also used that language. And if their identity, and if they were in a relationship that could be seen as fembutch, they were aware that it was seen as uncool or even old school. And so people said that, with people mentioning, I have seen butch identifying women being mocked on many occasions in the gay scene. People saying, I want to be with a woman, not a woman that looks like a bloke. Someone else saying, feminists have too simplistically refuted this identity as adopting problematic masculine codes and assume it is part of a binary, which dictates a sexual exchange that is based on prescribed roles and inequalities. And this is so not the case. And as I said about old school and uncool, people used that terminology too. They said, I know this is now seen as old school. I know this is seen as uncool now. People also talked about having to live up to certain labels and identities and the assumptions that people would make about them if they did take on certain identities or express them in particular ways. So somebody talked about, I would like to call myself a butch, but I don't feel my hair is short enough. And any time I claim that identity, people will tell me, oh, you don't look butch, but it's probably just anti-butchness and old school homophobia and misogyny. But I'm actually very educated and dress more like a posh guy, so maybe I'm more dapper. So people talked about these hierarchies, which we would understand in masculinity studies as being hierarchies of masculinity. Masculine of centre or masculine identified queer women or lesbian women also talked about the pressures of those. And particularly people talked about those if they were masculine presenting or masculine identified, but were not actually looking to have a relationship with someone who was femme identified. If they were looking and attracted to other masculine people, they talked about how nobody ever assumed that they were. everyone would assume that because of the way they presented and identified, that they would be looking for a relationship with a more feminine person. So that brought pressures as well. People that identified as soft butch, for example, or preppy or effeminate, they were concerned that they wouldn't be properly seen or properly read. And also perhaps that they wouldn't be seen as attractive to the groups that they wanted to be seen as attractive by. And that association more generally and overall of butch identity or butchness with a sense of unattractiveness is itself an old school assumption and association, and it's a persistent one that has been around for a long time, and it is one that respondents were aware of. One person responded and said, people are scared of being butch because 1, society tells us we are ugly and unwanted, and 2, LGBT politics says that masculinity is evil and that butches are controlling and that femme women should reject butches for, quotes, real women. And the whole feminist sex wars did come up a lot as well. People were aware as well that the butch identity is a highly visible one, is very visible, is a symbolic, sort of totemic representation of lesbianism and lesbian identity. And for many people as well, that wasn't a negative. It was actually kind of embraced as a source of pride and confidence, and indeed even sexiness and attractiveness. So to end on a more positive quote, having looked at all the negative discourse that there was around these identities, I'll end on a more positive quote. This was a young person who identified as queer, gay woman, and masculine of centre, and sometimes as a butch dyke. When I dress and present as masculine, I feel more attractive. I think it's because there is a swagger in it, and it's a very visible way of saying who I like. It feels powerful and sexy, even though I've also felt the most vulnerable and had the most abuse looking that way too. I'll leave it there. Thank you.